It's a pleasure to be here and have a chance to talk to all of you about something I'm going to talk about, which is very, very exciting, demographics. Now, I want to also say how much I appreciate that very nice introduction. I don't always get such nice introductions. Now, not because people want to be rude to me, but sometimes they don't know what this strange thing is called a demographer. And I remember well, I was speaking in a small East Texas town and to an organization, and the gentleman who had been given the job of introducing me had gotten ill at the last moment. And so another gentleman got handed my introduction, and I could see out of the corner of my eye that he was having trouble with something, and I knew it was that word demographer. And in the part that had been written up for him, someone had written that I was a prominent rural demographer. And this gentleman, trying to do his job, at the end of his introduction said, well, I guess it's best just sum up Dr. Murdock by saying that he is a top rural demagoguer. So I'm going to try not to be a demagoguer today. But I am going to talk about population change because I think there are really several factors that are important to organizations like yours. And during the last couple of years, I've done a lot of speaking to groups that have the same kind of interests in terms of the same kind of clientele as you do, and I think we'll find that those are interesting. Let's start off by looking just at some population change. And I apologize again. This is one of those slides. I have a friend of mine who says, you know what I like about you, Murdock, is you take about 600 numbers, put it on a slide, put it up in front of a bunch of people, and you say, as you can plainly see. Well, this is one of my as you can plainly see slides, and as you can see, as someone from Texas, I've also limited it to a time period that is equal to the period of time since Texas first allowed the U.S. to join it. And you can see that growth has been, however, slowing down if you look at the U.S. part. And one of the things to recognize is that we expect growth to continue to slow, in particular as we look at certain population groups. This is a chart I want to show because there's a lot of misunderstanding about undocumented immigration. I hear lots of wild stories about numbers out there. This is the U.S. figures, and you can see we think there's somewhere, close to 12 at one point in time, 12 million people. But I think the best estimates are made by Pew, and Pew, it's made by a person by the name of Jeff Passell. He happens to be an old friend, graduated from the University of Texas at Austin, and in fact, he has some parents that live still in Dallas. It's not because he's a Texan that I like him, it's because he does such careful work on undocumented immigration. And I've said to him several times, I said, Jeff, when I go out there and I talk to the public, what they say is, oh, you're crazy. There's actually 20 or 25 million undocumented immigrants. I hear it every day on talk radio. A very valid source of information, obviously. But I said, you say there's maybe 10 or 12 million. What makes you so sure that there's not 20 or 25 million? And he says, and I'll tell you what he says. He said, because there's one thing you cannot hide, and that is dying. And if there are really 20 or 25 million instead of 10 to 12 million, these are the healthiest group of people who have ever walked the face of the earth because they die at a level of about 10 to 12 million. So I think it's important to kind of put that, so to speak, thing to rest. When you look at our growth, and I think it's important to talk about the growth, this is, of course, our largest states, some of which have had very rapid population growth, and it's not just because I'm from Texas that I show Texas at the top of that arm. It is, in fact, that Texas has had phenomenal growth. This is what we've had when we look at it in percentage terms, and you can see one pattern about these states. And that is they are, in most cases, all either southern or western states. One of the myths about population growth in the United States this last decade was to say that large cities had come back. There was growth in large cities. Now remember, if you remember that chart I had up there a minute ago, the percent of increase in the United States population was 9.6%. How many of our 10 largest cities have had growth of 9.6%? One, San Antonio, Texas. So growth has not been necessarily as large an urban phenomena as people sometimes think. Well, let's look at the regions for a minute because that's important. This is the regions of the United States as defined by the U.S. Bureau of the Census. And this shows the growth from 2000 to 2010. You can see how much more rapid the growth was if you look over that percent change column in the South and the West than it was in the Northeast and the Midwest. This is the pie, if you look at it in a pie chart of that period of time. And if you look at the most recent data, which the Census Bureau has out, which is 2012, and we will get some new data in about a month or so, you can see we still see the fastest growth in the South and the West. Well, if you look at the South and West again, you'll see Texas had the largest increase in terms of numerical change, but I really went through this to get to this slide. I am a native of the great state of North Dakota. And never in my life as a demographer did I ever think I would have the chance to see North Dakota being the fastest growing state in the country, okay? And you can see it's up there. Now, a few people from Texas do point out that there's somewhat difference in the period of time or the amount of absolute change that it took for North Dakota to get its rate of change versus Texas. But despite that fact, I'm going to keep sticking up for North Dakota. I argue, however, the most important change that is occurring is not the change in the numbers, but the change in the racial and ethnic composition of the United States. We're going to have a lot of slides now. I'm going to show similar things, but you don't have to look at very much, and so I'm going to kind of show you what I want you to look at. First of all, I want you to look at certainly the percent change from 2000 to 2010. You can look at the numbers, of course, too. Then I want you to look at the percent of total change that was due to each of the racial and ethnic groups. Now let me start off by saying when you look at this chart for Texas and you look at the percent of total change due to non-Hispanic whites, it's 12%. There has been greater racial and ethnic diversification in the United States as a whole in terms of change than was true in a very diverse state like Texas. And if you see overall, what this means is 8% up here, 92% of all the growth that occurred in the United States from 2000 to 2010 was due to minority populations. 92%. And 55% of that total growth was due to the Hispanic population, about, as you can see, about 14% to the African American, about 16% to the Asian, and then, as you can see, a small percent to all other racial and ethnic groups, including American Indians, etc. Now, let's look at what's coming. This is the child population of the United States. The child population of the United States grew very modestly. But what perhaps is most astonishing is that the number of non-Hispanic white children in the United States decreased by 4.3 million from 2000 to 2010, was offset by an increase of almost 4.8 million Hispanic children. In fact, had it not been for the growth in the number of Hispanic children, we would have had one of the largest declines in the child population in U.S. history. But this isn't only in a few areas. Let's look at the pervasiveness. I want to do something very simple. This up here are counties, of course, and blue means that a particular group grew in terms of that particular population group. Red, of course, means decline. So we have about 3,200 counties in the United States. And you'll notice that there were about 1,700 of them that had declines in non-Hispanic white populations and about 1,500 that had increases in non-Hispanic white populations. Now you're going to see a little few pink ones up there where the change was such, that is, there were less than 100 people in that group and we didn't think it was legitimate to talk about change. But remember, blue is growth, red is decline. This is a non-Hispanic white population. This is the Hispanic population. So if you're one of those folks that think that Hispanic population growth is a California, Texas, Florida, New York, and a few other areas thrown in, you are absolutely wrong. The reality of it is that it is a national phenomenon. This is the African American population group. This is about 2 growing to each 1 declining. Know that where there's a lot of red is in the old part of rural South, where you're seeing a lot of areas where traditional black populations are declining in numbers because there's not much immigration. On the other hand, there are places like Dallas and Houston, like places like Atlanta, that have very rapid African American growth. And this finally is the Asian population, which of course there are lots of areas where there's too small a number to legitimately talk about change. but you really have about 16 growing to each one declining. Well, let's look at this same thing very quickly for the regions. In other words, some people say, well, yeah, you've got these patterns, but how much are they diversified? How substantial and how dispersed are those patterns? Now, this is, of course, the Northeast region, which you all know where that is. Look, this is not the child population. This is the total population that declined by 1.3 million in terms of non-Hispanic whites. This was the growth in Hispanic populations, and you can see growth in all other population groups. If you look at the child population of the Northeast, look at this decline. And it had not been for substantial growth in the Hispanic child population, in the Asian and other population, you would have had even greater decline. That's the Northeast. This is the Midwest. Decline in absolute terms, and as a result, all of the growth, of course, was a result of minority populations that did occur, and 50% of it was due to the Hispanic population, another almost similar percent to the Asian population. This is the Midwest. Again, decline substantially, and as you can see, all of the offset really being, or about half the offset being in terms of the Hispanic population. And then let's look at the South. Huge population growth overall, and you can see that even there, only 4.2% of the total growth, only 20% was due to non-Hispanic whites, meaning 80%, including 46%, which was due to the Hispanic population. Well, finally, we have the South region in terms of children, and look at what happened even in the South. The number of children, non-Hispanic white children, declined. Huge growth in the number of Hispanic children. And if you look at the West region, well, growth here overall, and in fact, in that area again, 87.5% of the growth was due to minority populations, and 60% was due to Hispanic populations. Here's the children, and you see the same kind of patterns of decline in terms of the West region, and you see the growth and where it came from. Well, I'm going to do just three more. Because certainly this growth and these patterns of change must be in certain parts, right? So a lot of people say, yeah, I know about that change in urban areas, but I know it's a central city phenomenon. Well, let's take a look at that for a few minutes. This is metropolitan central cities across the United States. This is the growth in the total population, 22 million. You can see that about 263,000 was non-Hispanic white, but about 13% of it was Hispanic, so the 59% of all the growth, and overall, as you can see, 98.8% of the growth was due to minority population, so that's what we expect. When you look at the child population, you see some of the patterns again that we expect. Look at that decline in the number of non-Hispanic white children, offset by growth in Hispanic children, in Asian children, and in other children as well. Well, what about suburbs? Well, this is suburbs. This is historically, if you will, the whitest part of America. But even here, in this decade, only 50% of the growth was due to non-Hispanic whites. 50% of the increase was due to minority populations, with 29% basically being due to Hispanics. And when you look at the child population, decline, even in the suburbs of non-Hispanic white children, offset by increases in, as you can see, tremendous increases in the number of Hispanic children, even in the suburban parts. Well, finally, let's go to rural. These are the non-metropolitan counties. Again, you see growth, in this case in all racial and ethnic groups, but about 80%, all of the growth being in terms of minority populations. And when you look at children, well, non-metropolitan areas of America have had real problems in retaining children. Not because they're dying off, but they're moving out of those ages and they're not being replaced. So again, my point is the patterns of growth that we're seeing and change is not just urban. It's racial, it's ethnic change, and it's change that is pervasive across various parts and regions of the United States. Well, why do we really care about racial and ethnic change? And I argue we should care because due to a variety of historical, discriminatory, and other factors, these demographic characteristics are unfortunately tied to socioeconomic characteristics. They are tied to the resources that people have to buy goods and services in the private sector. They're tied to the resources that people have to pay taxes in the public sector. And as we change our population, if we do not change the socioeconomic factors that go with those, we will, as we change our population, change the very socioeconomic structure of America, the very socioeconomic structure that all of us, including your agency, work with. Now, I'm going to do something else again here. And I want you to look very quickly at these, but I'm going to point out that what I simply want to show here is some patterns of change. And that is, almost everywhere you look, you'll see two patterns. One is that rates of poverty for African American and Hispanic households tend to be 2 to 3 times as high as they are for non-Hispanic whites. And you will see that incomes tend to be about 40% or so, 60 to 65% rather, of what the incomes are for non-Hispanic whites. And that's Anglo, that's a Texas term, sorry that it's on that face. The other thing I want you to note is that if you look at the 99 to 2009, if you've heard anybody out there claiming that the average American household is not in fact significantly poorer in 2009 and 10 than it was in 1999, because this is in constant dollars, you're wrong. The reality of it is this last decade hit Americans hard in terms of overall income structure. Well, now again, so all you really have to do here for what we're going to look at now is to look at these and compare to this in either case. So that's the United States. This is the Northeast region, about the same, 3 to 1, 2 to 3 to 1. This is the Midwest, 2 to 3, 2 to 3 to 1. If you look at the South, about 2.5 to 3 to 1. And if you look at the West, it's pretty much the same. In other words, these patterns are not Northeastern, Midwestern, Southern. They are a result of population composition factors, which are important as we look forward. Now let's look at one other factor, and again, I'm going to do just look at one here, and that is, I want you to look at the percent of Hispanics with less than a high school level of education. This is 38% in the United States. When you look at, and here I went to putting it third, this is the Northeast, it was 33%. This is the Midwest, it's 38%. This is the Southern region, it's 37%. Here's the Western region where it's 40%. And if you start looking at some large cities, and I'll pick on some Texas cities, for example, the percentage of Hispanics in the city of Houston with less than a high school level of education is 56%. So these are dramatic changes that are parts of our population characteristics. What about the future? Where are we going to be in the future? Well, this is the most recent projections from the Census Bureau. That 420 is thousand, so that's 420 million. We're expecting to gain, in a sense, about 112, a little over 100 million people over the next 50 years. That's going to be slower growth than we had. But I want you to notice what happens to the non-Hispanic white population. Well, it goes from 197 basically to 179. Absolute numerical decline. On the other hand, when you look at the Hispanic population, it's going from about 50 million up to about 129 million people. So the growth, again, is not only going to be more. If you begin to look here at the absolute numerical increases, what do you see? Well, you see the non-Hispanic white population, we expect it to have an absolute decline, and you can see the growth that we expect to see, and we can see very clearly that the growth will be dominated, or most likely dominated, by Hispanic populations. And this is the way you divide up the pie. When someone first gave me this particular slide, and looked at non-Hispanic whites alone, I said, wait a minute, what did you do? You can't do a pie chart like that. I said, pie chart has to have proportions. And the young man said, well, what do I do with non-Hispanic whites if I want to do a pie chart? Well, I guess you show it just like you did up there. That means that none of the growth is going to be due to non-Hispanic white populations. Well, When you look at it by age, we're going to age, of course, as everybody's heard about. We're going to go from about 13% that are 65 plus up to about 22% that are 65 plus. But one of the interesting things about that change that we're going to see is this is 2010. And notice in every age group, non-Hispanic whites are over 50% of the population. That's 2010. Now notice, by 2060, there's only one age group, 65 years of age or older, which over 50% of the population will be non-Hispanic white. Well, let's talk about for you guys. Now you've seen what the characteristics of our population, right? Now, this is some data I got from your recent visitors survey data. Non-Hispanic white, 96%. Looks a little different to me than the population of the United States. And if you noticed when you looked at those figures on income, okay, and you looked at the income for African Americans and for Hispanic populations, what did you see? 40s, basically, mid-40s. And so you have a very different population that you're serving right now than is the population of the United States today, and that is going to be the population of the United States in the future. Well, let's look at this a little more here. This is some data we got from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the National Survey of Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife Associated Recreation. And this is the proportion of the total population, 16 and older, involved in these activities. So you see, for example, in hunting, 7.8% of non-Hispanic whites, 0.8% for Hispanics, 1.4% for non-Hispanic African Americans, and 1.8% for Asians. Fishing, 17% non-Hispanic white, 4.7% for Hispanics, 7.8% for non-Hispanic blacks, and for 8.5% for Asians and others. Here's wildlife watching. 12.2%, 2% for non-Hispanic whites, 2% for African Americans. You can read the chart. I don't need to read you the numbers on the chart. And when you look over on public lands, you see that the numbers a little bit different, but not substantially different. Well, what if we go forward in time? Let's take wildlife watching on public lands just as an example. If you take the total, well, let's just take the total. What do you see? Well, we expect, remember, how much is the population of the United States going to change? 108, 12 million, something like that, right? And what's going to happen to the percentage? Now, this is taking rates of participation from best data sets we could get and applying them to those population projections. So we would go from 18.6 basically million to 20.6 million. 2 million increase on 100 and some million base. And you can look at others and you'll see similar kinds of patterns. And you'll see over time, hunting is pretty much stable in terms of absolute numbers. Fishing goes up a little bit. Wildlife watching in any place is, so to speak, the 22, the 23, the 24, the 24. In other words, these projections suggest at best your numbers are relatively stable, but on a much larger base. And so here again you see what happens in terms of numbers. You would have less change than you might want to have, and you would have change as well in the percentages that would be from different in terms of a racial group over time. But here, for example, is hunting. And there's some change, but if you put that alongside the population change, no, it's not real promising in terms of how well you are doing in terms of gaining new clientele. And here's especially, look at this column right here. This is the numeric change from 2010 to 2060 in people involved in those activities for different periods of time. The bottom line is the bottom set of panels, and you can see what happens to your non-Hispanic white group. Now, This gives you the percent kind of change in the same kind of way. What we're seeing then, and we're looking at one other way of looking at this is in terms of pie charts, is yes, the change, you're picking up other racial and ethnic groups, but you're not picking up anywhere near what you need to be representative of the American population. Now, when I talk to people that build boats, when I talk to people in the fishing industry and the hunting industry, they worry about these kind of percentages, and they say to me, for example, how are we going to protect to what we want in terms of those areas if we are less and less representative of the population of the United States? That's an issue, I think, that certainly you're facing as well. This simply shows that in all of these, we're seeing declines in the non-Hispanic white base. We're seeing increases in Hispanic population groups that reflect populations, but they're not at the level that those populations are of the total population base. I'm going to let that one go. So what do you see over time? Well, this is really the chart that shows who fished, in over periods of time, according to all of those projections that we've seen when you apply the projections for 2011 and 12, but also the base from hunting fishing basis. Look at what would happen. You basically keep 11% people fishing, which is relative stability. And on the other hand, when you look at hunting drops fairly dramatically. And your percentage is pretty good for wildlife watching away from home. This is looking at projections of the future, and this is where we've done something very, very, I think, useful in the sense we said, what happened, however, if we could actually take all of the population groups that are growing, and we could make sure they were as interested through your urban programs and other things in these areas as non-Hispanic whites are. Remember what the total changes were in most cases? Well, we had 2% overall, for example, on wildlife watching. This is the numerical increases we would have if we had minority populations involved in those same recreational activities at the same rate with their population growth, but with the rates of non-Hispanic whites had in the most recent survey data. So the benefits in the sense of new participants, I would argue the benefits in terms of new adherents and new advocates would increase substantially as you increase the number of persons from minority groups that are involved in these activities. Well, let me just take boat owners, because I found boat owners to be particularly concerned about what's happening, because I'm not talking about here now rowboat owners. I'm talking about the folks that sell fairly expensive boats. This is data that shows male and female adult recreational boat ownership rates in 2010. This shows by race ethnicity, and you can see that boat ownership, of course, is primarily a non-Hispanic white factor in adults. And we did some projections for them as well. And their overall growth during this period of time was about 43%, 44%. The population is going to grow more like 75 or 80% during that period of time. They were very concerned about these particular patterns. We're seeing the same thing in terms of percent change for other activities. And so this is about adult recreational boat owners. They're going to stay primarily non-Hispanic white, but that's not good news, because if they were getting their share of other populations, they would have much higher overall percentages in terms of all racial and ethnic groups, and their overall changes would be much higher than what we see here, where we see, again, a change, a shift, but not the shift we want to see in terms of ownership. Well, let me talk for a minute about this, and then we'll talk about the term I have up there, which is education. What am I saying? What I'm simply saying is, I think there are, for agencies such as yours, 2 or 3 factors to consider. One is, how do you get that urban audience to care about you? But also, how do you get that urban minority audience to care about you? And I argue that that is primarily a result not because they're not as involved, not as interested, rather, in what happens to their environment, but it's due to the third factor, and that is the socioeconomic factor. It is easy to talk about being more involved in these activities, but, you know, as a group of Hispanics in Austin one time, we were talking about various issues, and I brought up the recreational thing, and they said, you know, most of our folks are worried about paying the rent, and they're worried about saving a little bit of money so their kids can go to college, etc. And recreational activities, except small-scale ones, don't get as much attention. They can't get as much attention. So what I'm saying is I think that in addition to building urban programs, build programs that appeal to minority populations, and build programs in which you may have to do more to get involvement. And that is, for example, when you look at lots of Hispanic populations, we've done some surveys, we've been involved in some of those, car ownership is significantly less. So if you've got a refuge on the area of a city and you want kids to get involved and you want them to get hooked on what you do, you may need to work with some other groups in that organization to get buses, to get other kinds of transportation that gets those kids to an activity that they cannot afford to get to on their own. So it's going to take extraordinary actions, I think, particularly when you take into account the economic and the socioeconomic factors that are involved. Well, let me say just a little bit about education. And it's not just because I'm a college professor. It is because education is one of the things that we've got to put a lot of money into in this country, because education pays. Now, and here's a good example of that. This is 2011 data, and you might notice that 7.6% rate up there that we have. Notice that anyone that had an associate degree or higher made more, was less likely to be employed than that overall rate. In other words, if you had even an associate degree, you were going to have a less likely to be unemployed. When you look at the income, look it over at the other side, you'll see similar kinds of patterns, only for bachelor's degree and above. We know that education pays, but then, this is Texas, and this is a very, very, very complex chart, except what I want you to do is to see if you go across for virtually every level of occupation, even operatives and laborers, education pays. The better educated person working in labor positions will make more money than the poorer educated person, and it's true for all racial and ethnic groups. Education pays for everybody. So when people tell you that education really doesn't have the same meaning for X, Y, or Z, well, the data don't really support that particular item. Where are we going in education? This is some recent projections, and the numbers aren't as important. To simply note, as we begin to look, we expect more and more of our college graduates and everything else to come from minority populations, but the numbers, the percentages are below what they will be in the population. Well, what am I trying to say overall? The reality of it is that there are now two population groups, primarily in the United States, in terms of demographic change. One is an aging, literally off the end of the life chart set of non-Hispanic whites. And they are declining in increasing numbers of areas. That meaning there are more dying than being born. And so if you look at this particular chart, the white group up there is in blue. Notice, you've heard of what population pyramids, right? Population pyramids are supposed to get bigger and bigger at the bottom. The one in blue doesn't. Now why? Well, let's look at some characteristics of non-Hispanic white populations. The average non-Hispanic white woman in the United States is 42 years of age. Another way to say that is if you're going to have a bunch of babies, you had better get started. Okay? And I won't say what one of my colleagues at Rice often says, when he brings this up. He speaks quite a bit in various audiences. And he says, and keep in mind that I am willing to help in any way that I can. So I'm not going to say that. Now, 42 years of age, fertility for non-Hispanic whites has been below replacement for over 20 years. Over 20 years. So we're not likely to come back as a result of natural increase, the excess of births over deaths. In fact, we're likely to continue to decline. Well, what's the other source of population growth? If you look at nationally, it's immigration. And where would people that look like me come from? Europe. And Europe is the oldest, slowest growing major region of the world and the only major region of the world that the United Nations projects to have fewer people in it in 2050 than it had in 2000. We basically, and I can tell you, you can pay for this comment in some audiences, we are basically not coming back, or as I was misquoted in one group saying, it's basically over for Anglos. Now, I didn't really say that. Let me tell you a little story about that because it's one of those, you have traumatic experiences and it helps to get it off your chest. I was speaking to the Mexican American Legislative Caucus in Texas, and when I got done, this gentleman stood up and he said, sounds to me like you're saying it's basically over for Anglos. So the reporter started that as the headline in his story, and then he talked about all what I said, never mentioned who said this, okay? Well, then phone calls started coming into the president to fire me. I had several interesting telephone calls questioning my heritage, but the one that I liked the most was a very polite email. He said, "Dear Dr. Murdock, I wondered if in your analysis you had considered the fact that there are thousands, perhaps millions of families like mine wanting to move to Texas." He said, "I'm a 49-year-old survivalist living in central Pennsylvania," which I didn't know had survivalists, but they did, according to him. He said, "I have 6 children," and he said, many of us are, and I'm Anglo, and he said, many of us are wanting to move to Texas for 3 reasons. He said, first of all, it is a truly conservative state. Number 2, he said, it has the best homeschooling laws in the country. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what he said. And then number 3, he said, which we all knew would be the case, it has absolutely the best gun laws in any state in the country. So I told my colleagues, if you look out the window, see an SUV, white kids hanging out of every window, and 4 gun racks, you know that they have come, because he told me at the end of it, he said, you need to understand there are thousands, perhaps millions of households willing to come to Texas to, quote, save it. Okay? So we have some problems in terms of perceptions. But the point I'm trying to make is that as we look to that future, it is true that basically for non-Hispanic whites, we are not, again, going to be as dominant as we've been in the past, and that may be good, not bad. You'd have to assess that from different triangles. Well, who is the other population? The other population is minority, predominantly Hispanic. The average Hispanic woman in the United States is 28 years of age. There's a lot of childbearing years between 28 and 42. Their migration has slowed down, but is still fairly substantial. And their fertility is declining, but is still above replacement. So what we have is 2 populations. By the way, that blue population is a non-Hispanic white population. That red outline is the Hispanic population. I'd argue for companies, I'd argue for agencies, that the reach is to get so you serve the people of the United States in the form that they are going to be. For most agencies, that means converting from a focus in, whether it's meant or intentional or unintentional, who look like me, to people who look like the more diverse America. And I think it means as well to recognize where people are. And I think the socioeconomics are a big factor in terms of what people participate in, not only why they participate in it, but mostly because it's what they can afford to participate in. You have data that shows this. I certainly have done some work over the years that shows that in terms of concern for the environment, caring about the environment, that's a really very pervasive pattern of feeling and so forth in the United States. But the ability to actuate that support, the ability to utilize the services that our agencies that do this provide so that you really have a stake in what the Fish and Wildlife Service or what other agencies that do this kind of thing do. That's a different story. And so I think among the gaps you need to bridge is not only the bridge in the urban, but I think the bridge in the socioeconomic so that you can provide ways for kids with less socioeconomic resources to become involved in terms of activities that you do as well. Because I had to show you that slide because I knew you were deeply moved. But I think this is the thing to keep in mind. The reality is that the future of the United States is tied to its minority populations. There is simply no doubt about that. And there's nothing inherently good or bad about that. But what it does mean is that we need, as governmental agencies, and I spent most of my time in government in one form or another prior to coming to Rice, to keep in mind what I see when I work with private entities. And that is the phenomenal sensitivity to the coming and current diversity. I was last year at an international conference that Coke had. Well, Coke sells less than 20% of its products in the United States. But one of the things that it recognized, in fact, and you hear it all the time, when you talk to minority populations, and particularly these folks who study minority populations and were members of minorities, is one guy looked at me and he said, "You know what I like about you white guys?" Which he said, meaning it, they didn't like white guys generally. "You think we're all the same." I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, if you've got a Hispanic, you don't need an African American. If you've got an African American, you don't need an Hispanic. And if you've got a Hispanic and he's Cuban, you don't need one that's Mexican American or that's Puerto Rican." He said, "Some way one of us serves all." Okay? They don't do that in Coke. They had at least 15 separate Hispanic groups that they were cultivating in just North and South America. Different countries, different forces, different times. So I think taking that population and looking at its diversity within the diversity is really critical if you want to be successful in terms of your enterprise or any other kinds of enterprise. So again, I think how well you do as you go forward is a function not only of how well you serve urban areas, but how well you serve diverse audiences, and that are diverse both in terms of racial and ethnic issues and in terms of socioeconomic issues. Well, a lot longer ago than I like to think about it, when I first got involved in this demographic game, I had a fellow graduate student said to me, he said, "You're a demographer." He said, "What is this you're going to do that's going to keep you busy?" He said, "World population growth is beyond a decline." He said, "The baby boom is way over." He said, "What is it you're going to do that's going to keep you busy for the rest of your career?" And I agree with him that keeping track of these and other demographic trends would, and it has, and it will, I think, keep me busy for the rest of my career. But I argued with him, and I would argue with you as well. The demographics is not best left to demographers. If you don't take into account these and other demographic trends as you plan for the future of your agency, as we plan for the future of governmental services, period, And as you plan for the future of organizations and communities and so forth, I think if you do not do that, you'll be much less successful than if you do take those into account. Thank you. Question? Yeah, you want to take some questions?
Okay, we'll take questions now. So if you would like to come up. Any questions? And we'll ask for you to wait for the microphone.
Looks like they're want to break.
You're all thinking of cookies, aren't you?
There's
For the
a
break.
lady right there.
One right up in the back. All right, Mendel's coming for you.
Hi there. I guess this question is for Will. Reaching way back, you spoke about the list of the problems or the trends that are causing disconnect or issues. I was wondering if you could pick out one of those and maybe help expand a little bit or give a highlight of a success story of overcoming some of those trends.
Wow. I think there's a lot to be excited about with the efforts that are going on, but I think a lot of those trends are ongoing, whether we're talking about sprawl development, 2 million acres a year getting fired back up again. We're starting to see slight flattening out in obesity rates, and I don't think anyone really understands what's going on there. There's a mild cause for optimism there. But I don't see any of those trends, and I didn't even mention climate. So I'm afraid I can't say to any one of those trends that we're starting to see things move in the right way, which is why I think what we're all planning on doing and trying to do right here is so critical, because it really addresses all of them. So I hate to disappoint you on this one, but I think those trends are all going to continue going the way they're going for some period of time, and we have to learn how to live with them, I think, and then adjust ourselves accordingly in the same way that we have to learn how to live with changing demographics and plan for the future.
Let's wait till you get the microphone on. It's not working. Nope. I'll repeat the question for you, or here comes Mendel's got one.
Yeah.
We've got live streaming people can't hear on
Okay.
the.
I'm
there we
sorry.
go. Mendel's very quick.
Dr. Murdock, can you give some, sorry about that, can you give some insights? You've been doing this research for quite a while. Can you tell this group how you worked with Texas Parks and Wildlife and some of the things that how they used you? So.
Yeah. It goes back a few years when, I won't say who was commissioner at the time, but he was very interested in getting his board and others to look beyond what they were most interested in. And what he told me his board was most interested in was how big a rack they would have on the deer they shot in the fall, okay? And some of them were very prominent baseball people and others. We worked with him with not only demographic data, but with survey data that showed pretty well in terms of fairly comprehensively that people were very interested in recreation and outdoor activities, but that when you took people with less means, financial resources, they were interested in a much more diverse set of factors than was true when people who at least some of the people that were interested in specific types of activities that were much wealthier. Another way to say it is that Hispanics and African Americans were interested in a whole range of activities because they recognized they didn't have the resources to be hunting and fishing, particularly in some of the areas. So we worked with survey research, we worked in terms of demographic analysis, and it worked with one other thing that was very interesting. And that is something that was pretty unpopular with his professionals. And that is what he was faced with this was the time when everybody was interested in backpacking, trail walking, And his staff said, you know what we want to make such trails that, by golly, Bruce Jenner would have dropped dead for just going on one of those trails. They're going to make those so challenging, people will love them. And we certainly don't need a bunch of parks that have barbecue pits and picnic tables and that sort of thing. But guess what? When he went to the fastest growing group in Texas, both African Americans and Hispanics, what did they want? They wanted picnic tables, and they wanted areas where they could congregate particularly with Hispanics, their larger families. But his professionals were sitting there saying, that's not what I learned about. I learned about the diverse set of activities, and I'm going to make this more appropriate. But appropriate, what they didn't understand in many cases, was that appropriate some way in their head, and they didn't mean it this way, they didn't mean to be this way, but were activities more likely to be taken part of by, I should say, people with more socioeconomic resources. So he made some very difficult decisions. He had some difficult times, I should say, in Texas, because that was pretty unpopular to do. But he ended up saving more during a time of economic crisis. He saved more parks in Texas than he was expected to save, and he saved them by serving the larger clientele. And he said, if you wanted, a new emblem on for our agency, it should have a picnic table in the back.
Other questions?
There's a lady right there.
Yes, thank you. Will, you talked about the barriers for parks and green space and urban restoration in terms of finding large tracts of land. It's expensive. And I wonder if you could address sort of this notion of long-term maintenance of green space and parks. And I know that's another barrier that was raised with city parks directors that we met with recently, and how they're trying to tap innovative sources of funding from public works departments who are addressing stormwater management. I just wondered if you could maybe cite some examples of innovative funding for your parks and green space efforts.
Sure, and a couple of thoughts on this, because I think they're two separate issues. How do you buy the land? How do you develop the park or restore a natural area, et cetera? And then how do you take care of it into the future? And I think there's several things that are critical. I mentioned this idea of participatory design and community engagement. And if you are, as we do, able to work with kids in the classroom to get them out there with their tape measures, measuring their playgrounds, looking at other schools, talking to their classmates, engaging their families. And then we also, in New York, we were working with the Bloomberg administration, actually able to get joint use between the community and the school, so that after hours, the community could actually use these playgrounds as a park. You get this wonderful set of this engagement that really leads to ownership and leads to stewardship. And so the cost of maintenance goes down simply because you have a much higher level of participation, and really people really, they want to keep it cleaned up, they care about it, there's less vandalism, et cetera. So that's, the engagement piece is critical in handling that aspect of it. I think philanthropy is another piece that's filling in for the lack of public funding, and we see this. The obvious one is the Central Park Conservancy, and that's easy to do, relatively speaking, to taking care of small neighborhood parks in low-income neighborhoods. But more and more, there is private funding coming in to assist and support, and it isn't just money, but it's friends groups, it's people who help organize activities and get engagement and do cleanups, et cetera. So there's more volunteerism as well as private money coming in to help carry the burden that the public sector is having a harder and harder time to do. And so, I think those are two ways in which we're seeing a difference. And then you mentioned, if you have a hyper-functional park, to use your term from earlier, that serves so many different purposes. If it's a sponge soaking up that first inch of stormwater that's not going to go into the sewer system and then helps the city stay out of violation of the Clean Water Act, then you can actually engage the sewer department. And as it turns out, sewer districts oftentimes have more money than park districts. So again, there are a lot of different ways. If you're creative and can have parks serve multiple functions, then I think there's a chance to bring more money to the table. But there is no one solution. I think it's a lot of small solutions, but engagement is absolutely critical. Giving the community what it really wants is critical, and then looking at finding multiple sources of funding that will help underwrite the multiple benefits that parks provide is also critical.
Right there in the red and white, she had her hand up a while. Thank you. And this one.
Uh-oh, same one.
Got your back.
One that doesn't work.
There's one behind you, Charlie.
Give it up, Charlie. Let it go. Let it go.
This question is for Steve. I'm just wondering, in all of your data, how population that is bi or multiracial is figured in.
Well, actually, the Census Bureau or I don't decide that. You do, when you answer your census form. And you know, until 2000, what we did is we allowed you to be only one race group. You could only answer one race category, and you could run one ethnic category. So, for example, I was a department chair at the time. I had a African-American faculty member who was married to an Anglo, okay? And so the way they responded in the 2000 census is they said, well, we got to do something about this. And so they put down one of their two children is white and one of them is black, with the idea that they'd get the right mix that way. But since 2000 and now in 2010, people actually indicate their own combinations, okay? And you can be up to 6 different ethnic groups, racial groups, and you can be then Hispanic or non-Hispanic. Clearly, we think those are going to change over time. What's been surprising is that when you looked at the total numbers, for example, we had about 5 to 6%, depending on the area, that said they were for more than one race in 2000. In 2010, when I was working in the 2010 census, one of the former directors called me up and he said, I'll bet it's going to be 19%. 6% again. Okay. Now, why? Well, when we looked into it, what you find out is that when you look at particularly Hispanics and others, and I'm not one to be talking, but here's what the data show. What the data show is that, yes, at upper middle class in those areas, you see a lot of intermarrying. But when you look at people who are kind of working class and trying to make a living and so forth and everything and don't have the social circle, then you find much lower rates of intermarriage. True for African Americans, it's true for Hispanics. So we expect that in the future we're going to see those go up, but the last census it was about 5 to 6% again overall. Now, I'll be the first one to say that I find that probably to be too low, but census doesn't do anything to those numbers. We take them right off the census form as people report it. And there's a lot of things that go into that. There's been, and the diversity of numbers of categories. After I got confirmed, a former director called me up and he said, Steve, the thing you're going to have more trouble with than anything else is people wanting additional combinations and categories. And I said, well, the census, it's too late. He said, well, yeah, that's right. But I'm telling you, and this was right after I got nominated. And one particular senator, I won't mention who he was, called up and said, I want to see the designated person before his confirmation hearing, but no sooner than 2 hours before his hearing. So, sure enough, so an hour and 45 minutes before my hearing was to take place, I walked into his office, and he said, when are you going to make Dominicans a separate category? Because I'm deciding whether or not to vote for your confirmation, and I want to hear the answer to that before I... So all I could tell him was, well, I'm afraid it's too late to add additional categories, because it was, because we're already in the printing stages of the census form, and certainly make it clear to other folks. Now, I will have to say, of course, the census never is impacted by political things. However, there were some people that wondered why Hawaiian and other groups were a separate category. I'm here to say I think that has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that a certain senator who passed away from Hawaii was on the Oversight Committee for the Census for 20 years. I'm sure it had nothing to do with that. At least I was assured by my predecessors. So there is some politics in that, but the actual response is what people say they are.
Other questions? There was one over here
One
before,
here, this
right?
lady
Did you
and
notice? Okay. And then there was one up top too, if somebody wants to go up there so we can get them in. And
Yeah, one over here too.
And this is for Dr. Murdock. And I'm going to be, I don't mean to make it sound like what you just described, but I was curious, you did say diversity within diversity. And I know I have a son who works at a very diverse school district, and he's constantly wants to whack the administration over the head because they think all Hispanic kids and all areas they come from are identical, and they constantly make mistakes that way. Is there, you showed a lot of maps, you showed a lot of things. Is there, looking at immigration patterns, any kind of information on where migration has come from, specifically from Central American people? And so there is?
There is, and there is a tendency, and this has been the plight of minorities forever in the U.S. and every place else, is to treat them all as if they were the same. And what you find is socioeconomically and otherwise is there's very big differences. One that I find experientially is I find a lot of differences between the perceptions and in terms of acceptability of being in the category of Hispanic between Cubans and others. Now, I'm not sure for all the reasons of that, but I will tell you one is that at least the first Cubans that came were very different socioeconomic backgrounds and statuses than people who came later, and than many immigrants from other groups. And we've found, I've seen this in 2 or 3 universities, where they were going to have an Hispanic program in Texas, and they were primarily wanting to serve Mexican American kids, and they put somebody from Cuba in, and they wouldn't work with them. They would not work with the Mexican American kids. I myself had somebody I was given the job of recruiting the director of a new Hispanic center. And I'll give this guy credit. He came down and interviewed with me, and he was Cuban, and he said, I really couldn't work with these people, so I couldn't take your job. Okay, well, I don't want to pick on Cubans. What I'm simply saying is that those differences, you're exactly right. What we tend to want to do, particularly administrators want to do because it's easier, is to put everybody in categories. And I think for most of the things you're doing, you're going to have to be more like Coca-Cola and less like the dean that I had, who decided that one person would be fitting. And it's true as well. We're seeing, for example, in the African American community, that many of the recent immigrants from Africa, just don't mix very well with other African Americans. They don't have the same background. They don't have the same socioeconomic background. And these are all factors that, as a friend of mine said in very clear terms, that's because you white folks can only see one color when you look at anybody who's different from yourself. They're either X, Y, or Z. And I'm afraid that's somewhat true. I hope.
Question.
There's a question for you also, I guess, but it relates to what Will said. I think this idea of how the wildlife community has focused so much on trying to get people to be really participatory in hunting and fishing and bird watching even. We spend so much time trying to get people to do the things that we think will get them to care. And that I think you just your picnic table example was a really good one. And I know that Will mentioned, and I've seen a lot of the polling too, that, a lot of the of different ethnicities care very much about conservation, but not from the same reasons that white people, Anglo people might or something. And so the voting on all these ballots is very high for minorities or poor people because they're more community oriented. That's what I've seen. But we still spend all of our time trying to get people where we, to become a bird watcher or something, and then they'll care more. And I think that's really a totally different model than how we've operated for so long.
Well, again, I think, again, I hate to keep overusing the Coke model, but the private sector would say, what do these people like? What do they want? They would not say, we're going to give you the product you need. If you don't like this soda, you just need to learn to like this soda over here because it's the best soda for you, okay? Coke would never do that because they wouldn't sell their products. Yet sometimes, and we're all trained professionally and we believe in certain things and we have certain activities that are critical ones. It's not that we're doing something we mean to be doing something that's not good for your overall growth of your clientele. We're telling them what we think's best, but it may not be best for them. It may not be what they want to do. And so I think one of the things that somebody like Coke does, and I'm sure your agency could do it as well, is they do daily, weeklies. They can at least do monthly surveys, extensive surveys, sub-classified with a variety of types of people socioeconomically to find out what is it that you want in a product. Because people in groups have different levels of sugar or sweetness in their drinks. They have different kinds of levels of caffeination and other factors that they want. And so they market and create the products that people want from very different backgrounds, very different things. So they produce, the Coke we drink in the US is not the same Coke that is drank in other parts of the world, okay? It has a different formulation, slightly, from one area to another, and there's a whole set of products that you won't find in the US you find in other markets and vice versa. So I think one of the things I was trying to say earlier is differentiating your clientele, segmenting your clientele, I think is one of the ways that you get increasing buy-in to what you are and what you can do and who will support you at the polls and other places.
Can I piggyback on that? This Park Score tool that we've developed that really it's a gap analysis tool in a sense. It looks at that, it looks at a 10-minute walk. And we map communities that aren't within that 10-minute walk, and they're usually in orange. But if they're low-income neighborhoods with lots of kids, we put those in red because we think that those are the critical areas to be focusing on. And I have to say that we use that tool as an organization to say, where can we make the biggest difference? Where can we help people have a connection where they don't? And when we go into communities that are truly underserved in the way of parks and gardens and green playgrounds, et cetera, there is invariably an enormous hunger for those assets. And it doesn't matter what the ethnicity of that community is. It just doesn't matter. It's African American, it's Hispanic, and the huge diversity, refugee communities. There is a real hunger for an opportunity to connect. But if we don't actually make the effort and engage with the community, figure out in what way they want to connect, what we could end up doing could be completely irrelevant. So I think the desire is there, and it's our job to figure out how to deliver in a way that's really going to help people make the connections that we want to see them making and which they desperately want to make themselves.
Great, thank you. Well, that's a great place to end it right here. So